Welcome to a new episode of InFocus with Ejaz Haider. This program is supported by the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research. CESPR is an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore, and it tackles issues that impact contemporary security and strategic developments. This program is part of that effort. Back in the day, Romans used to send military expeditions to fight and force to surrender churlish kings and tribal leaders. I mean, churlish, not exactly churlish, but those who stood up to them, and the Romans thought they were churlish in so doing. Among many examples, that of working Getarox, a Gaelic chieftain, stands out. So Caesar forced him into submission, imprisoned him for 6 years, paraded him before public in 46 BC, and then, of course, ceremoniously executed him. Now, I'm not saying that US President Donald Trump will execute Nicolas Maduro. Well, we've seen the public display already, and in any case, the US has directly and indirectly toppled dozens of foreign leaders, created circumstances where the leaders were killed. South Vietnam, Congo, Dominican Republic, Iraq in 1963, then in 2003, Libya in 2011. The list is quite impressive. What has happened in Venezuela and is happening, Trump's threat to Colombia and Cuba, and horror of horrors for the Europeans, Greenland, is all given in Trump's National Security Strategy 2025. So let me read out the relevant excerpt from that. And the headline is Western Hemisphere. And it reads, the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, after years of neglect, the United States will reassert and enforce the Monroe Doctrine to restore American preeminence in the Western Hemisphere and to protect our homeland and our access to key geographies throughout the region. We will deny non-hemispheric competitors the ability to position forces or other threatening capabilities. This is important. Or, and this is even more important, to own or control strategically vital assets in our hemisphere. This Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine is a common sense and potent restoration of American power and priorities, consistent with American security interests. This is what the excerpt is from the NSS 2025. Now, it's quite another thing that President James Monroe's so-called doctrine, which was part of his speech to Congress in December 1823, was actually an attempt to put European imperial powers on notice, especially Spain and Portugal, not exactly to assert US imperialism in the Western Hemisphere. That had to wait until 1898 when the US and Spain went head-to-head, and the US acquired Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and then the Philippines, which is a amazing story of how they actually deceived the Filipino revolutionaries. But we are not discussing that. Going by that, the first corollary was actually Theodore Roosevelt's corollary. Trump's Monroe Doctrine is therefore more in line with Teddy Roosevelt's than James Monroe's. But let me, without further ado, get to my expert guest for this episode, a friend of the program, Dr. Daniel Markey, currently a senior fellow with the South Asia and Chinese programs at the Stimson Center. Dr. Markey was a member of the U.S. State Department's policy planning staff. He has also previously served as a senior advisor at the U.S. Institute of Peace, another victim of President Trump, by the way, where he focused on Indian politics, South Asian security, and China's regional policies. He's also associated with SAIS at Johns Hopkins. His most recent book, which came out in 2020, is China's Western Horizon, Beijing and the New Geopolitics of Eurasia. Before that, in 2013, he wrote No Exit from Pakistan, America's Tortured Relationship with Islamabad. Thank you so much, Dan. As always great to have you on the program. It's more like a tortured relationship with the Europeans now. So you got your third book in the making.
Possibly so.
Yeah. But let's begin with, and I understand neither of us is an expert on the Arctic or Latin America, but there are these broad strands here that we can discuss. And it's interesting in relation to Venezuela because you keep an eye on China and the Chinese interests. And it's kind of ironic that a Chinese delegation had met Maduro, I think a few hours before he was abducted. So here's the thing. I want you to try and tell us, is it because we've heard like three different explanations. One is that, oh, it's about drugs. The fact is that, Venezuela is not into fentanyl, and the cocaine that goes through Venezuela mostly goes to the European ports, not really to the United States. But that's one explanation. The other is that, oh, Maduro's, heading a narco-terrorist state. And the third is now about oil. Which is surprising in the sense that it's like $58 a barrel, and between Canada and the United States, North America is producing like 28% of the global demand. The global oil market is already in a state of glut, and another million barrels from Venezuela makes no sense for the U.S. companies, frankly, in terms of they won't even break even. So, what is it about?
Fantastic lead in and an amazing question. Not surprising, but all this leaves me scratching my head as well. And I think a lot of Americans too, including some of our elected leaders in Congress, at least on the Democratic side of the aisle, are puzzled by exactly what happened here and why. And frankly, they got no explanation beforehand, which the administration claims it had to do for reasons of national security and not to blow the operation. And they've barely gotten much in the way, they say, of an explanation after the fact. You're right that there are a welter of different claims that the administration has made in many ways to justify its behavior and the particularities of it. That is, it's a law enforcement exercise if you're looking to downplay the nature of the intervention. It has to do with oil and economics if you're looking to make a larger claim about and a politicized one at that in the American context, a claim about oil and its centrality to the U.S. economy and the global economy, which Trump does with some frequency. And then there's this question of kind of regional dominance, kind of a traditional, whether it's the Monroe doctrine or just spheres of influence approach to the Western Hemisphere, that kind of aligns with a certain kind of robust, I wouldn't even say realist, sort of neo-imperialist approach to international politics that in many ways harkens back to an earlier era of realpolitik and spheres of influence globally. I think the answer is, first of all, I can't, as I've said many times before, climb into the brain of our president right now. It's a complicated and dangerous place, I think. But also, I think this reflects, as many major U.S. policy moves have in the past, reflects this kind of a convergence of different strains or strands within an administration, each pursuing its own kind of particular aims, but sometimes aligning to push for one particular outcome. And a president who, in this case, seems so malleable and open to different approaches that he can simultaneously be the president who, effectively demands a Nobel Peace Prize for bringing peace around the world, and on the other hand, is launching effectively a minor invasion of a neighboring country, contrary to international law by any reasonable definition. So you put all those pieces together, and I'm afraid I still, don't answer your question because there is no good answer. And I think that's actually for your audience, critically important that we not attempt, and it's so hard to do because humans attempt to impose order on the world in terms of how we think about it. But we should not succumb to the temptation to bring consistency or strategic order to the behavior of an administration that is in many ways almost literally all over the map and cannot be defined in that way. Now, maybe with the benefit of hindsight over 4 years, we'll have a better sense as to how to do this. But with so many, and I know we'll get into this, but with so many outstanding questions about the direction that this administration will actually take and the extent to which that those decisions may or may not align with its rhetoric, I think it would be folly to try to do that right now.
I perfectly understand what you're saying. And, I mean, it's very difficult to structure one's world around Mr. Trump. But might I still hazard a guess?
Sure.
I mean, that's basically our business. So what can we do? So here are two things. One is that if the NSS 2025 is anything to go by, and I read out an excerpt in my introduction, which is that, and frankly, I mean, that's not Monroe from where I stand, and more Teddy Roosevelt perhaps, but it's certainly not Monroe. So one is that, okay, this is the hemisphere where it's not just about threatening capabilities, it's not about Khrushchev putting missiles on Cuban soil, but we are also not going to allow, for instance, Russia or China to acquire some kind of strategic presence in the Western Hemisphere. So that's Venezuela, part of the BRI and all of that. And I know, I mean, since you are a China watcher, you obviously looking into the Chinese approaches into Latin America and also Africa. So that's one. So you actually go for a physical sort of manifestation, if you will, of your resolve to not allow a non-hemispheric state to, or adversary or peer competitor to position himself there. That's one. The other is that it's not so much about oil, but I would like to sort of harken back to the 1974 agreement that Dr. Kissinger had with King Faisal bin Abdulaziz, which was about trading oil in dollars. And the currencies, and so it's also a signal to the BRICS countries about trading outside of the dollar. And this whole sort of December meeting where they came up with this currency that they call unit with a uppercase U, that this is how, so currency swaps, local currencies, this unit will finally sort of, become, although there are too many obstacles to that, but there's an entire attempt to move towards that direction. And so that basically means that you are divorcing or divesting the dollar from one of the most valuable commodities in the world. And that is not acceptable. Do you think these two assumptions make any sense at all?
Look, I think you're correctly putting your finger on things that we have now heard as some of our president's favorite bugaboos or topics or issues that that he likes to raise again and again. Right? He is clearly he has made repeated statements about the dollar, about the desire to defend the dollar, about his frustration with any notion that there might be some other currencies that might displace it. He's certainly responded on points with respect to the BRICS that this kind of immediately raises the specter of something that might, some currency that might displace the dollar. So yeah, that's a part of what he's thinking. And then in terms of the regional centrality of the Western Hemisphere, a desire to make sure that the United States is the dominant player there. We hear this not just with, of course, Venezuela, but now whether it's Greenland or Panama or whatever. I mean, these things seem to resonate with him. And yes, so I mean, I think we can, and many of us will be in the business of trying to connect the dots here so that we can, in effect, predict what the next thing will be, or how these things, if they're consistently applied, would amount to answers about, say, how Trump will actually stand with respect to China. And so where I would caution still is that, yes, I think, you've rightly identified features that made or make this behavior, these policies in Venezuela kind of make sense. But do they then translate naturally into a prediction about, say, what U.S. policy under Trump will be with respect to China. Now, maybe they do, maybe they don't, but I'm going back to my previous point. I would say our president is flexible enough of mind or forgetful enough or something to maybe make completely different moves when it comes to his China policy. And maybe make moves that at the outset will look a certain way and then later will go an entirely different way. That's what's problematic about kind of using these data points as predictors of future behavior in this current circumstance. Now, we can say that's true of every administration, right? What I said earlier about different strands of policy impulses coming together to frame a policy outcome like an invasion of Venezuela, that was true for the Biden administration and every other administration before it. However, some of those have been, I would say, marginally to significantly less dependent upon a single individual and have been marginally to significantly more inclined to hold to a consistent worldview or approach, or at least a systematic, institutionalized way of making decisions in a way that this administration simply is, by every account, not doing. And so I just am afraid I don't want to discount that wild card reality here, because, we have to factor that into the business that we're in, which I think you're rightly pointed out. We are in the business of attempting to make sense of this for a purpose, to think forward and to anticipate things yet to come.
Absolutely. I mean, if regardless of the ideological differences between the Republicans and the Democrats, and sometimes there not really been any pronounced ideological differences. We've seen the neoliberal order being, proponents on both sides of the divide, the political divide. But there has been a common strand since Second World War, where the United States decided that it's going to create a financial and security global architecture, and that it is going to pull in any number of other states as partners, especially in Europe, but not particularly focused on Europe. You have Japan, you've got South Korea, you with the Oceania and all of that, and even in South Asia, for instance. Pakistan was a great example of that. Later, India, for instance, to have those allies. And even if it meant picking up the tab, which it did. But this particular administration, where I think it has been consistent, and correct me if I've got that wrong, but this is, and about 30 years ago, there was a Trump interview, ironically to Playboy, if you will, where he talked about, he said, the Japanese and our allies, they've got their hands in our pockets, we are overstretched, and so he's been consistent that way. And now he is very brazenly, look at what Stephen Miller's, Stephen's wife did, and then what he said to CNN. It's like, listen, we are or as Mr. Trump puts it, we're the hottest country, and we are the most powerful country on the planet. We've got the most powerful military on the planet. And so we're going to do what we desire to do. And, you have to suck it up. Does that have a cost? It might sound very bombastic in the short term, but do you think there is a medium to long-term cost of this?
Oh, there's no doubt in my mind that there is. But I come at the world viewing the relationship between the United States and allies and partners and even adversaries in a way that I think takes into account the utility, but also the value of alliances. And maybe in some ways I overweigh those things, but I think that clearly, in my view, the Trump administration underweighs this value. And you're quite right, sees allies as free riders on American power. Now, where this comes to a head is sort of effectiveness. Ultimately, the United States, the Trump administration is right. The United States is powerful enough to go it alone and to use its military to throw around its military power in a variety of ways that can be either effective or self-destructive. What we have seen, unfortunately, and I think what a lot of Americans actually thought Trump believed, was that the overuse of military power is ineffective. And that it wasn't a direction after the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that they wanted to see the United States take more of. And so when Stephen Miller makes these comments, I think he's, he taps into a certain amount of American nationalism, kind of hard-edged. We are powerful and we are the most powerful nation on earth, and that is popular in certain circles. But he also fundamentally misreads how it appears to me the vast majority of Americans, in terms of their own self-image, would like to believe that we should be using that power. And that is, most Americans, as far as I can tell, would wish that we use it less. Yeah. So that means when it comes to effectiveness, look, if the Venezuela adventure turns bad, which it has every potential of doing, if other countries, including our allies, begin to go a different way because they believe the United States has forsaken them, if this comes at more tangible costs that are evident to the American public, if either of those, then both the effectiveness and the popularity of these approaches will wane.
Yeah.
So nothing that the Trump administration is doing, in my view, is necessarily set in stone or, again, a predictor or defining of the future fully, and could be brought back, say, by a subsequent administration. However, having said all of that, it's really important what he's doing. Yeah. These are massive shifts in American behavior. And so I don't mean to underestimate, when the United States pulls out of many international organizations, denigrates its traditional alliances, steps away from partnerships, raises questions about kind of who's with us and who's against us and how we will use our military force overseas and whether there are any rules that govern that force at all.
Yeah.
I mean, even if they're honored in the breach, but do we even talk about them? Do we just actively say, no, these rules don't apply?
Yeah.
That's a shift. That is a meaningful and significant shift. And the world is right to pay attention to that.
Dan, I want to ask you, because you also served on the U.S. State Department policy planning staff. So, you've checked these boxes: policy from the outside as a think tanker, policy from the inside and teaching and all of that. What do you think is what's the word I'm looking for in terms of all this policy making, if you can call it that? How much input do you think the U.S. State Department is giving to this administration, rather than the Secretary of War, as Hexeth likes to style himself as? My sense, of course, and I don't have any hard data, but my sense is that the U.S. State Department is a kind of helpless adjunct to whatever is going on.
Well, like you, I'm not currently in the U.S. government, so this is one step removed. I would actually take your point and push it even further than you have.
Okay.
Which is to say that I think that the number or the parts of the U.S. government, national security apparatus that are operative right now, very, very small. I think that mostly the president is making, if not making his decisions single-handedly, making them with a tiny number of sometimes trusted confidants in the room, and that most of the rest of the U.S. apparatus, rather than feeding into the policy process, has been downgraded to implementing whatever comes out of the White House, and in fact, attempting to interpret the meaning of what comes out of the White House, which catches them by surprise as much as it catches you or me by surprise. So I have seen this, or versions of this, pieces of this, from the very beginning of this administration, where people in offices, including the State Department, but not just the State Department, were utterly blind to whatever process or decision-making moves that the administration was making, and were simply hearing about them, sometimes through social media or traditional media, and then having to make sense of them, and then having to do something that suggested that they understood what they were doing as best as they could. That's what we're dealing with. That's not just the State Department. I think that's the Defense Department, or large portions of it. I think it's parts of the intelligence community. And it's not just, the Deputy Secretary of State. Marco Rubio, now being dual-hatted as National Security Advisor, appears to be in the inner circle on a lot of these things. So he's meaningful, but not as Secretary of State, but as kind of counselor to the president, and chief diplomat and mouthpiece of the administration to explain its policies, both to Congress and to the public. Pete Hegseth seems less meaningful as a generator of policy and more as a loyal and very vocal defender of that policy. And most of the rest of the people who I think very highly of, professionals throughout the U.S. government, are finding themselves simply having to go for the ride.
Yeah.
Deal with things as they come out.
Yeah. No, I just very quickly before we move on, I got the sense, if you look at the congressional hearings, and I've seen Hegseth, I've seen Kristi Noem, I've seen Kash Patel, they've really, really been great, but they have this very sort of cavalier attitude towards, one of the things that they constantly do, which seems to be a common denominator, is to talk about the legacy media as, there's all fake news and all of that. It's like they don't, frankly, put it somewhat crudely, they don't give a damn, which is kind of surprising. But anyway, I want you to, since you
I'll just make a quick comment on that. Is only that though is you're absolutely right, but that is also a reflection of the state of the media certainly in the United States, and I think many parts of the world, which is that our political leaders, even in vaunted democratic countries, are not being held to account because we live in because we live in a media environment which is so segmented that they feel like there is no mainstream to which they are required to speak. And this is a fundamental change that's taken place over now probably 2 decades. Has been gradual, but has reached an apex moment where you're right, they can, without any apparent cost, not just not speak to or denigrate those people, but not even invite them to be in the room, except on occasion when they deign to do so. And when they, Trump just had a group of New York Times reporters in the Oval Office and deigned to speak to them for like 2 hours, partially because it seems like he feels he doesn't need to worry so much anymore. He can say or do what he pleases.
Absolutely. He has been brazenly, at least on 3 occasions that I can recall, told the reporters, you're stupid. You shouldn't be doing this job, which is kind of, anyway. Yeah. But here's the thing. Since you watch China, what do you think she is thinking with reference to Venezuela?
That's a good question. I would say I would first retreat, in a sense, to first principles about how China perceives its projection of power and influence and interests globally, and say that China has, not just in Venezuela, but Iran, most recently I've been looking at Afghanistan and many other places, made a pretty sharp distinction between what it considers its core interests, things like Taiwan or Tibet, Xinjiang, and so on, and its extended and perhaps much more easily sacrificed interests. further afield. And so while you're right, you made the point earlier that Chinese officials were in Venezuela right before this went down, this US invasion, and that clearly China has seen Venezuela as a kind of a useful partner in terms of importing oil and having other investments there as well, and was eagerly, I think, hoping that Venezuela would be yet another country in the world that it could continue to exploit in terms of natural resources that are quite useful, including in sort of high technology space.
Yeah.
All of that is true. And yet China can also, it seems, or it believes, effectively walk away from some of these investments and these relationships when the risk gets high. And or if it feels like it doesn't feel like it needs to confront the United States over these issues.
So this is a very important point that you're making. But here's the thing, and this is not necessarily prejudicial to how the Chinese perceive them. Just historically speaking, when you have these peer competitors, and you essentially trying to build an empire. The Chinese talk about the first island chain, second island chain, and third island chain is, of course, the global one. And they have to begin with the first island chain because that's their backyard. They are, just like the United States says, no non-hemispheric competitor to come here. So they also want to be in a position where no non-hemisphere, as far as their hemisphere is concerned, no non-hemispheric competitor can come in. So I perfectly understand that. But at the same time, the kind of inability or the unwillingness, if you will, at this point, to actually try and push back, for instance, in the Middle East, for instance, in terms of Iran. And also, the Venezuelans are, a long distance off. But if China has to be the peer competitor, then at some point it has to do more than just condemn US actions.
Yes, at some point. But this is where we see, I would say, both the limits, the actual concrete limits of Chinese power and capability. In other words, what would pushing back against the United States in Venezuela or Iran actually look like if you're the Chinese military or intelligence services, security forces? What would that really mean? And do we see the material capacity to do that at a reasonable cost to the Chinese state? So we see, I think, just a capabilities gap there that still exists and will be maybe filled, but it will take time if they choose to. But also, I think a sort of a motivation gap on the Chinese part. Because what you pointed out, I think, is correct. The Chinese have a series of concentric circles that they've drawn around China that define their core interests in less and less, as you go out those concentric circles away from China, their interests become less. And as I say, they've been rather disciplined about seeing the world this way. Now, it's been a debate in China. This is an interesting point. A debate as China becomes a global power, should it be asserting itself at the global level on the global stage, or should it be doing it piece by piece, firming up its place in its region first, and then gradually from that base of strength, asserting itself globally? And last spring, they had a Central Conference meeting on what they describe as their neighborhood or the periphery, in which they, I think, my read is they reinforced their sense that it should be build your base of power in your nearby neighborhood first, and then extend further beyond that. And if you read that into sort of Western or traditional American kind of IR terms, that does sound like spheres of influence thinking. And if you adopt that, again, if you say, well, then that's kind of shorthand explanation for Chinese behavior, then all the more reason why they would see it as foolhardy to do a great deal more when Venezuela, on the other side of the world, very close to the United States, is being punished. And they might even go to the further extreme of saying, well, if the United States wants to assert itself in its sphere of influence, and we want to assert ourselves in ours, that's not so bad either. That's a world that we can live with for some period of time. That may be what evolves, but I will say, before Trump and before this administration, no American president in memory has been content with a narrow spheres of influence characterization of American power on the world stage. Every American president, at least since the Second World War, has been concerned about the rise of a peer competitor on the Eurasian continent, which is not in our natural sphere of influence. So therefore, if this is in fact a direction that Trump is taking, that's a piece of the huge divergence in American policy, which may or may not be welcomed in Beijing.
Yeah, very quickly. I just your quick thought on this. I was just thinking, because this question of, we are talking about Venezuela. Let's take Iran, for instance. And Trump has been quite brazen about, we're going to bomb the hell out of them. And, Netanyahu was also there. And he obviously has this obsession with Iran for his own strategic reasons. How about the Chinese fly in a storm to signal that they have a presence there? I mean, it is just speculative, totally. But in terms of signaling, that shows a certain kind of resolve without having I understand. I mean, I've always said that the Chinese foreign policy is more about Tai Chi than about sort of, running on the treadmill and getting high adrenaline. But nonetheless, at some point, you say, okay, if someone comes for Iran, then we're physically there. I mean, what do you think that's the kind of signal that will be taken seriously by the United States, or would it redound to China's disadvantage?
Look, again, I come back to the military capability part here. We could be 10 years away, maybe less, maybe a little bit more, from a point in which China would have the confidence militarily to do that, to feel like it could basically kind of in a Russian style, because this sounds a bit more like Russia in terms of what you're describing, impose itself in a conflict on the side that the United States has not picked, and make itself relevant in a way that's uncomfortable for the United States. So we'd have to put into our calculations. But China has not had that global power projection military capability or sought to develop it fully yet. That's not been its priority.
Yeah.
So as I said, we could get there. And I think that, in the natural progression of things, in my sense, China is likely to get there because it is a rising power and it is continuing to devote a great deal of resources to its military. But remember, like, just how timid China has been militarily, just about everywhere, before we think, well, maybe they do that in Iran. Like, it's just not worth it. What if things go wrong? Other things are much more worth it, like showing its strength over Taiwan, which it's been doing just in recent weeks. That's an area where China wants to make its point felt. So, so that, again, I use this word a couple of times now, discipline. China has a certain strategic discipline, which I think is more reflective of its policy process, as far as I can tell. And that discipline inclines them to focus on what they think really matters, more than being distracted by these things.
Yeah. On a lighter note, it's almost like they're using the Pakistan military to test the capabilities of their weapon system.
I wish that was an even lighter note, but I think you're right. I mean, I think there's a lot that could be said there.
Yeah. So, a final question, and this is really where things get interesting, because this is not about Venezuela, this is not about Colombia, it's not about Cuba. Greenland. I mean, the Europeans are going round in circles like headless chickens. For the last 80 years, they have been next to the mother's teat, frankly. And now the mother says, "Oh, I'm going to wean you off this." And they have absolutely no idea
Hmm.
how to go about it, what to do. And the biggest irony is that their response to this Venezuela thing was so muted. Even where criticism did come, it was like, oh, hemming and hawing, and no clear uh, backbone, so to speak. And then you suddenly have Greenland thrown right into your faces. What are they going to do about it?
Well, I think the whole world has appreciated or come to appreciate that in many instances, Trump starts with a very extreme argument and then will back off it when met with a degree of reasoned, not force, but a reasoned reaction that stands up to him. In other words, his negotiating style is ask for the world first, and then fall back on things. And most countries have realized that, and the Europeans are no exception to that. So I think what we're seeing is a European move to present a united front against this claim of Greenland. And you've already heard the Trump administration talk about how, well, what they're principally concerned about is having the Russians or the Chinese there, and how we need to, the president doesn't want to take it over by force. He wants to buy it or whatever. So there will be a continuing drama on all of this. And I think the Europeans, in a direct answer to what you're saying, is they will continue to try to present this unified front. And the policy the analogy I would draw is to their position on Ukraine, where they also have been scared to death by a variety of Trump statements about capitulation to Russia, and where over now a year or so, they have tried to find ways to push back, sometimes politely, sometimes more forcefully, but to try to do so in a unified way that convinces Trump of the folly of walking away from Ukraine. And I feel like sometimes they feel they've been successful at this, sometimes less so. They'll try the same thing on Greenland. One last point on this. It should be remembered that Europe before NATO and before the post-war era was a continent of almost perpetual conflict that brought the entire world into 2 world wars. And if there has been anything that the United States has done in its history that has been an effective peacemaking effort, it was to build up those countries so that they didn't have to be warlike powers anymore. And so, if anything, it's a colossal forgetting of that earlier history to think that it would be smart for Europe to have to go its own way and build up its military. Yet again, you talked about the mother's teat. I would just say, sure, when the alternative is, as they say, for Germany to get the band back on the road again, I prefer seeing Europe sort of whole and peaceful, and that's what we lived with for many decades. And to see us willfully potentially throw that away is a huge strategic blunder, even if it was somewhat costly. And that's, I'm seeing a lot of that out of this administration. Very troubling.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I completely agree with you. I mean, this was one of the most effective foreign policy decisions, and the way it was built and all of that. But it's a bit ironic that we had basically arranged this program to discuss your Pakistan visit in South Asia, but the world is moving so fast that by the time we got around to recording this, so much else had happened. But I can't close the program before asking you to quickly describe to me your few days in Pakistan. Your
Sure.
impression. And
Sure.
where do you think South Asia is going?
Yeah, no, it was a great week in Pakistan, work week in Pakistan, but very brief. The central focus of my trip was to think about and ask about Afghanistan, and in particular about China's role in Afghanistan, and to better understand how a variety of Pakistani analysts and others perceive that. And I guess I came away, and I'd be curious what you make of this, but I did come away with a strong sense that we could be on the cusp of far greater escalation in Pakistan-Afghanistan relations, and that when I factor in the Chinese angle to all of this, that I feel that my conversations reinforce the sense that while China is interested in Afghanistan, it is, like I said about Venezuela or about Iran, is not so interested and doesn't have so much skin in the game that they will, continue to involve themselves when they see it as a losing bet. One way to put it would be that China has a kind of strategic patience on Afghanistan, and actually has a greater interest in its relationship with Pakistan. And so going forward, if things get worse between Pakistan and Afghanistan, China isn't going to be the central focus here, and isn't going to be necessarily even an important peacemaker between the two, although it's tried to play some of that role. So I guess, yeah, impressed by the potential for renewed violence and deeper trouble in the region, while simultaneously impressed by the extent to which China may sidestep that or attempt to sidestep that as well.
Oh, I largely agree with you. I mean, this is an entire discussion in and of itself, the structural reasons for the potential for escalation between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And it has to do not just with the ideology, but also various other factors, some of which are ethnic, some of which are historical, in terms of the Afghan irredentism, frankly. And so now, of course, the entire thing has been sacralized in and through a certain kind of Islamist ideology, which kind of actually dovetails very nicely with the ethnic, rejection of the international border and constant reference to it as a Durand line. Now is being dressed up in a different sort of garb, which is about the Ummah and
Right.
Islamism and the rest of it, and therefore a rejection of the nation states and all of that. So yeah, but I think that's something that we need to actually do a program
We'll have to come back. Yeah.
on separately. But it's always fascinating to talk to you, Dan, and I'm so grateful that you could take the time out and talk to, I was it's a broad canvas, but,
Of course.
I mean, it's not my fault, it's your president's fault. So, there we are.
Well, thank you. It's a real pleasure to join you.
No, thank you. This is all from this episode. If you like the discussion, do click on the subscribe button and give us feedback. Until our next episode, goodbye and stay safe.